Well, oldest one's almost 30.
You're like our grown-up. Wait, what's the... So I think for people in Europe, this is not so fun. I think if anything, they might watch it tomorrow or not, right? Or eventually.
Depends on their night habits. So it could be very fun for a small group of Europeans. Don't you guys eat dinner at like 1 a.m. anyway? Isn't this the right time for a little bit of entertainment?
Absolutely. There's somebody.
Yeah, Ali Reza says it's 1 a.m. He's enjoying it in the Netherlands.
Awesome.
Cheers to the Netherlands.
Right. Okay, well, I think we should probably just go ahead and get started here. I think it's almost...
And in Spain.
Spain.
And in France.
All right.
You guys are cool.
That's awesome.
Cheers to that.
Okay, yeah, I think we should go ahead and get started. So anyways, welcome to this event, Hickok and Poeppel dual stream model, 20 years since the first paper was published back in 2000. And so I'd like to just welcome David and Greg here. So just so everyone knows, this video is also being recorded. It's going to be posted up later on the C-STAR website. So before we get started with the conversation, I just want to give a little bit of background. I had some nice images and stuff. I'm going to omit that to try to make sure that the interpreters are visible. But Gregory Hickok received his PhD in 1993 from Brandeis University and working with Edgar Zurif as an advisor. And David Poeppel received his PhD in 1995, if I'm correct, David, from MIT. And you had two advisors, right? That's Ken Wexler and Alec Morantz. And I believe that your PhD was actually in linguistics, if I'm correct.
Close enough. Brain and cognitive sciences.
Brain and cognitive sciences, okay. At any rate, both of them have been publishing together for some time with the dual stream model. So I think just to start, there was a ton of questions that people had. This thing kind of blew up far more than I think any of us realized. So at some point I had close to 600 people sign up online. So thank you for your interest. And there were so many questions, I think it's almost impossible to ask them in person, but we'll see if there's some time at the end. And in general, I think we should feel comfortable just sort of going whichever direction seems to be interesting. If there's some topic that you guys really want to expand upon and go down, then I think we should just do that and not worry too much about fitting any kind of schedule or making sure we hit certain markers. But I thought it would be nice to sort of start, both of you, maybe we could start with Greg, since you got your PhD slightly earlier than David, and just discuss a little bit about how you got into the field, how you got started in general.
Sure. Yeah, I was 91 actually, not 93.
Oh, really? Wow. Okay.
Yeah. I'm even
You're an elderly man, really.
What do you think? I know. How did I get in the field? I was on a clinical track actually at UC Irvine, where I am now, and realized I was completely bored with clinical psychology stuff, counseling psychology. But I was really into the brain stuff. So I read Oliver Sacks's book, The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, like a lot of my generation did. And that was really exciting. So I switched to research and just wanted to do something in brain and behavior. And I happened to get admitted to Brandeis University to work with Edgar Zurif, who was doing language and brain. And so that's when I had to learn language. Wasn't that interested, but that's what he was doing. So that's what I had to learn. And I started taking theoretical syntax courses with Jane Grimshaw. and got into straight psycholinguistics is what I did my PhD on, and only kind of started doing the brain stuff when I went to MIT, which is where I met David. So it's just kind of pretty much an accident how I got into this particular field.
Okay, cool. David, do you want to talk about how you got into the field?
Equally accidental. I was, I really wanted to be a theater director or an actor or something like that, something fun and stagey, but it didn't work out. I was working in a monkey lab, in Peter Schiller's lab at MIT, learning about magno and parvo cells and learning what the geniculate is all about and what where systems and vision. That was what I was doing as an RA for a while, working for Peter Schiller and Nikos Logothetis. And while I was there, it was recommended to me that I listened to some lectures by this guy, Chomsky. And I thought, well, that sounds interesting. I'll go. And listening to those lectures was pretty interesting. And it was sort of like opening a curtain. So suddenly you see things in a very different way. And then I ended up going to graduate school thinking about doing psycholinguistics and neuroscience and some. So once I started graduate school, I was pretty interested in those topics. I took a bunch of linguistics courses with Alec Morantz, with a bunch of others, with Ken Hale, with Morris Halley, with David Pizetsky. And then I slowly drifted towards more brain and languagey stuff. And I think it's around that time I met Greg. Greg was a postdoc and I was a grad student at that point in brain and cognitive sciences at MIT.
Right. So I think those are two questions that I was interested in addressing. Is first how you guys met and what prompted this sort of collaboration to work together and to develop this sort of overarching view on the field. And then also maybe you can address this first, just talk a little bit about that environment in that greater Boston area around MIT. You both mentioned the work of linguistics and sort of getting into that. So maybe Greg, I don't know if you want to jump in here and just talk about that sort of intellectual environment that you were in.
Yeah, it was great. I mean, I would go to the Boston VA to do kind of, that was the Edgar's lab essentially. And people at the Boston VA, Harold Goodglass was there, and a really strong aphasia research program. So I got to go to grand rounds and learn all about aphasia. I was at Brandeis, which was exceptionally strong in linguistics at the time, with people like Jane Grimshaw. Ray Jackendoff was there at the time.
Mm-hmm.
People doing, other interesting stuff like Art Wingfield. Eve Martyr was, taking some neuroscience courses with her. It was great. And then we come over to MIT and you had, Alan Prince was at Brandeis too. Come over to MIT and you had, I sat in on courses by Chomsky. I was in Pinker's lab at that time. And it was just an incredible environment. Just anything you could want was right there in Boston, and a lot of interaction. So it was awesome.
Right. So I guess similarly, David, right, you started off doing more something that I would not associate necessarily with linguistics. Actually, I was kind of surprised. You did work on basic neuroscience and vision, but it seems like there was this stuff available at the time. I don't know if you want to talk about that at all.
I mean, it was the psychology department, as it was originally called at MIT, was, I think, already sort of intrinsically very interdisciplinary. A guy named Hans Lukas Teuber founded that, and it was his vision to have what I guess we would now call cognitive science, right? So he had super famous anatomists there, Wally Nada, and he had psychologists and psycholinguists. So he had sort of this vision of a much more integrated field. And I think that carried through. So I think when I was a student and Greg was a postdoc, it was the kind of mature version of that with healthy, even sometimes vitriolic debates between the neuroscientists and the cognitive scientists. They didn't particularly like each other. And so the cognitive scientists that I greatly admired, let's say Susan Carey, who taught probably the most fascinating course I ever took in developmental psychology, had not a super awesome relationship to let's say the systems neuroscience people, who thought that was just ridiculous as far as I can tell. So it was an exciting atmosphere because it was, deep in all the areas, but also contentious on the concepts. And that was fun. It was, I remember, I don't know if Greg, if you remember that, but for me, a very salient experience were those COG lunches, right? So those weekly lunch seminars given by, a student or a postdoc that were super exciting and brutal. This was not for the faint of heart, right? So, but you learn a lot, right? Just, you just get exposed to so much exciting stuff that everything was sort of in the air. There were this 4-volume book edited by Dan Osherson called An Invitation to Cognitive Science, which included tons of authors from MIT, from Penn, from Stanford, from other places. And there was sort of a vibe of the cognitive sciences being really rich and fascinating, and then beginning to link to neuroscience in some sort of early ways, which was cool.
So, I mean, how did you guys end up meeting? Like, how did that exactly, were you in the same department? I can't remember exactly how you ended up getting to know each other.
Same bowling league.
Yeah, it was the same group of talks and stuff we go to. Cog Lunch we were both in the same department, brain and cognitive sciences, when I was a postdoc. And I was in Pinker's lab, so it wasn't exactly the same in-lab, communication. But with Cog Lunch was one thing, and then I remember, didn't you host the cognitive neuroscience, McDonald Pugh cognitive neuroscience talk series or something?
Right, I hosted those, yeah.
Yeah, so I saw David a lot talking, and I was, pretty quiet like usual, and that's kind of how we met. We didn't interact all that much at MIT. I remember hearing David give a talk on his bilateral speech perception stuff, and I didn't believe a word of it at the time. It just wasn't strong enough. And I think I went and talked to you afterwards and said, what about Geschwin's model? It doesn't quite, he's got an alternative account, the lesion data, I'm not sure. Aphasia, left hemisphere, it can't be bilateral. And you hand waved and did something, and that was it for a while. And we didn't talk much until after we both left, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think we should come back to that, because I think that most people, including myself, really associate the bilateral thing with you, Greg, in the sense that you've been really pushing that a lot lately, especially. And it's interesting to think that that actually came from David. So I think this is the kind of thing that people might be interested in seeing, is these little hidden elements there in the procedure that went up to finally becoming the dual stream model, and what happened from there. But before we move on from that, I could not let you guys go without hearing your thoughts on the father of all cognitive science and modern linguistics, Noam Chomsky. You both mentioned him a little bit. Maybe you could just tell me, what do you think of that whole generative program in terms of approaching, okay, hold on. I think apparently the speaker is locked on Sarah. So let me just try to unlock that. So apparently everyone's been looking at just like one person. Okay, I think this should be fixed. Let me just see. Okay, looks like it's fixed. Okay, anyway, so going back to, again, Noam Chomsky, what do you guys think? What do you think of that whole program and that line of research?
Well, we wouldn't be having.
Sorry, maybe I should preface that. Maybe we start with Greg and then move to David. Yeah.
Well, let's start with David. We talked about this briefly yesterday, and David's got some articulate views on it, which I mostly agree with. So.
Yeah,
I don't even agree with myself. Well, first of all, just to, for historical context, I mean, we wouldn't be here and we wouldn't be having this discussion if it weren't for what happened in linguistics and the cognitive sciences in the 1950s, largely pushed forwards by Chomsky, right? So, I mean, first of all, there's a huge historical debt. The way the sort of psychology of the time and the philosophy of the time was debated and handled changed everything. And of course, that's the reason we have current linguistics, cognitive neuroscience, and so on. Now, one can like it or dislike it, right? So so for starters, we can have different views of that, but there's, the influence is undeniable. Now, so I wrote a chapter about this a few years ago. And so for me, the role of Chomsky it's both amazingly important and infuriating. And so what has his role been in some sense? On the one hand, so forgetting the historical role, if we wouldn't be here otherwise, for some parts of cognitive neuroscience of language, it's been incredibly important and productive and shaped the research program. For other parts, it's just ignored. Right, so there's a huge amount of cognitive neuroscience of language that just basically bypasses any aspects of the generative enterprise. For better or for worse, progress is made. But partly, and I was, chatting with Greg about this before, is that, Chomsky is sort of relentlessly undidactic, right? He just doesn't care if you understand stuff. He has a very clear view and theoretical stance, and he develops it, and he makes a lot of assumptions about your willingness to work hard to understand it. And it's just not for everyone, right? So it's technically sophisticated, and a lot of people have gone by it because it's just, you know, annoying. But he has not helped matters, and a lot of linguists have not helped matters by not engaging more and being sort of didactically transparent. That's just, I find that bothersome. That being said, the influence, the ideas, the conceptual architecture that he develops, I mean, is, you know, like probably the most important thing in all of our intellectual lifetime, presumably.
Yeah.
So on that point, I think, Greg, a couple things that you mentioned to me before was that you often use linguistics as a guide for your research, but you don't take it necessarily literal to the bone, right? You'll take sort of pieces of ideas and implement them, but massage them a little bit and use sort of what's helpful. Is that accurate?
Yeah, well, everything, I mean, if you look back at my publication record and stuff that I've written, a lot of what I do is integrative. I look at all sorts of sources of data to try to get some traction in whatever problem I'm working on. And I'm not committed to any one of them. It's just, you know, I want to integrate them and take the best of each. So linguistics is part of that. I mean, all of these fields are trying to account for data, and the data is, you know, in a lot of cases, it's legit data that we need to, there are things we need to explain, and the ideas are reasonable. But if you look at it from a different perspective, you get a different take on it, and it might not be exactly how it looks from within a field. And so linguistics to me is kind of like that. I mean, they're quite reasonable theories. There's lots of different ones. But when you start looking at it, I really try to integrate it with neuroscience or other sources. I think it's worth rethinking and, you know, trying to accommodate the same sets of facts with different perspectives. So that's how I approach it.
I mean, I think that leads naturally to what David may be famous for in linguist view is this granularity issue in terms of the terminology or concepts espoused in linguistics not lining up very well with neuroscience. And then maybe, I don't know if you want to talk about that at all, David, or you think that's been attacked enough?
Well, I mean, I think it's just a useful way to think about the nature of the problem. Right? So if you want to learn something about how language works, it's not a bad idea to ask a linguist, right? Because the way the problems are peeled apart build on a long history of really useful research, right? So it's not that field suddenly popped up in the 1950s and, you know, now we have a finished story. There's just a huge amount of data, of comparative linguistic data, of acquisition data, and so on, that add up to an interesting story. And so those are nuanced, detailed, subtle concepts. And the way we approach it in the neuroscience is sort of mismatch. This is what, you know, Dave Embick and I once called, I think we called it the granularity mismatch problem, right? So the way problems are characterized, they're just a very different grain size of conceptual analysis. Now, to me, that's like a practical problem, right? So I think both neuroscientists and linguists are not doing a great job dealing with that. That's to say, neuroscientists, for the most part, assume there's a kind of implicit hierarchy of evidence, right? So biology is better evidence than, you know, cognitive psychology or something like that. But suppose you take everyone equally seriously from an epistemological point of view, as you should, I think, then you have to look at, then both neuroscientists and psychologists or linguists owe translating the kind of the infrastructure of the fields into chunk sizes that are at the granularity that allow the formulation of linking hypotheses, right? So if there's no linking hypothesis between neural stuff and language stuff, that's kind of a problem, right? Then we should go home.
Right.
To take it seriously, you have to work on the details, and the details are hard, and you have to figure out, well, what a grain size of biological phenomenon is an interesting link to an interesting linguistic problem. But that's actually a practical issue, not a principled one. We could solve this if we were a little bit more, if we didn't suffer from, let's say, a poverty of the imagination.
Yeah. So this is one question I think I have is, a lot of your recent work has done a very good job, I think, of illustrating the effect of abstract linguistic properties on the neural signal, the things that can't be readily identified in the data at some kind of surface level. This is your work with Nai Ding and other colleagues, right? So I think this is very nice stuff. It's very compelling. And to me, it's sort of like a cherry on top of a lot of linguistic data and evidence that's been promulgated to support this. So do you think that's an effective way to try to address neuroscientists and psychologists? How do you get them to take the linguist seriously?
Well, the linguists have to get in the action, actually, right? A bit more. So I think linguistics in that sense has been, you know, my friend, colleague, former boss, Alec Moran, has a very, you know, has written about this and talks about it and thinks about, you know, linguistics as cognitive science. And I think it's the right way to think about the problem. Is linguistics, and theoretical linguistics in particular, hasn't done a great job in explaining why these phenomena are of broader significance about how the mind is organized and how you could break these things down into a kind of conceptual architecture that does have connections to, forget neuroscience, psychology, right? So the link from linguistics to psychology is just as hard as the link from linguistics to neuroscience. And so on the one hand of this, I think linguists actually have the obligation to be better at explaining this. Likewise, though, psychologists, neuroscientists, computationalists have the obligation to take that evidence seriously and not try to be sort of knee-jerk reductionist. And they have to say, these are, you know, compelling data, and so we have to maybe make adjustments to our own conceptual commitments to try to figure out how this works. And so this is, it requires a lot of give and take from the different constituencies, but it's sort of it's often comes across sociologically as kind of hopeless, but I just don't think that's right. I mean, you know, there's partly it's personality and sociology, right? These fields have developed differently, and then there's this personality. So some people, you know, kind of think all of linguistics is automatically Chomsky and you have to hate it or something like that. That just seems a little bizarre and kind of immature. But there's a failure on both sides to develop their own work in a way that permits the formulation of really serious, explicit linking hypotheses. And I think that can be done. And I'm kind of naively optimistic. And I know examples. I think there are examples where that is done. So, you know, it's just that we sort of blow it off. I mean, in neuroscience, we have really great tools and we just measure a bunch of stuff. And then we have these high level interpretations. Linguists have extremely subtle analyses of really cool phenomena that hold across, you know, 2,000 different languages, and then we just walk away as if that were nothing. And that seems disingenuous intellectually, to say the least.
Well, it's integrative work, and integrative work is hard. You have to, I mean, linguistics and neuroscience are completely different fields from their start, and to be able to integrate them, you have to master both, at least to some extent. That takes work. And then there's the fields in between. The integrated field just doesn't exist. So you have to reinvent the integration, and that is hard work. And people don't like to, you know, it's just hard to switch. This is not unique to linguistics and neuroscience or linguistics and psychology. It existed in speech production, the psycholinguistic approaches and motor control approaches that don't talk to each other. To try to integrate those things, which I tried to do, no one likes it because, you know, the motor control people say, you're not paying attention to dynamics and all this stuff, and the linguists say you're flattening the structure. We don't like it. It's just hard work, and anytime you try to put two fields together.
I think this is a topic I would love to talk about only for many more hours, and ideally like a multiple day session. But I think we would be good if we try to like dive a little bit into the dual stream model, and then if we got some time at the end, we can come back to this topic, because this is something that's really on the forefront of my mind. But in terms of the dual stream model, maybe a good way to jump into this is you guys can tell us which of the papers is your favorite and why, and then maybe that will help us understand the point of the model. So maybe David, which one is your favorite?
I change my mind every day. It's like, you know, you don't have a favorite kid. They're all special. But I think, and now, so yesterday I really liked our cognition paper, the bestest. the 2004 paper in cognition, because it really, what I really like about it is it addresses the patient work and implications for aphasia very nicely, and I think that's largely, almost exclusively Greg, and so we're not worthy, and it's useful and interesting. But then this morning, because I thought, what did we write 20 years ago? I actually leafed through the 2000 paper, and it's really, I'm sorry, I hate to say this, but it's a really good paper. Damn, I'm glad I was part of that paper. I mean,
what was it that you noticed?
It's just full of juicy stuff. I mean, we started with a very narrow conception of just trying to delineate speech perception as a process more carefully. We ended up talking about the functional anatomy of the process, links to the motor system, questions about lateralization. It had all kinds of interesting, juicy bits that then allowed us to develop further. So maybe, when Greg and I left MIT, those ideas have kept cooking in our heads. And then when we started working on it together, I guess we just threw a bunch of things in, and they sort of gelled as an interesting bunch of ideas. But I think if I had to say today, it would be the original paper.
Well, Greg, what do you think?
Yeah, the original paper it didn't start out as a dual stream thing at all. It started out as just doing a really simple, short thing where we would make the claim that speech perception is bilateral, which was David's idea initially. Well, actually, a lot of people were talking about it, a couple decades before. Sheila, who's listening, will remember the folks at the Boston VA, Harold Goodglass, talking about how receptive speech is more bilaterally organized than production. So, and other people have talked about that. But David was claiming that, and I didn't believe him, like I said, because the evidence that David presented was word deafness with typically bilateral lesions, and then neurophysiology, which was, you got activations in both hemispheres. But there were other explanations for both of those things. And aphasia, you didn't get aphasia from right hemisphere damage, you got it from left hemisphere damage. So, where's the evidence? And it wasn't until later when I actually was trying to present some evidence to my students. I was teaching a course. I wanted to provide some lesion evidence to back up the interpretation of bilateral neurophysiological activations, which was common then. And what people said was that the left hemisphere was doing linguistic computation and the right was doing prosodic or emotional processing of speech. And so I wanted to show my students the lesions that made that case. Where are the lesions in the superior temporal gyrus that produce the comprehension problems at the linguistic level? And it turned out there were none. You got production problems according to the literature. And so that's when I called David and said, hey, we should write, I think you're right about the bilateral stuff, let's write a paper. And that's how that started. So and the dual stream thing only came about because a reviewer complained that we weren't taking certain tasks into effect that did show a left dominant kind of neural correlate. So developing that whole idea in the course of writing that paper was really exciting, because it was linking it to vision. It was talking about things that are more general. And so I think that is probably the best work that we did, just coming up and putting all this stuff together. But the 2004 paper, we did get to talk about a lot more things without space constraints.
Yep.
And that was also very interesting.
Right, and I think people should know that the 2004 paper was part of a large series which you guys organized. And there's actually a Poeppel and Hickok paper, which is actually quite good, that discusses things in a broader context. And, and that's always been my favorite, is the cognition paper and the accompanying series of articles, which I think you guys were able to tie together. So
it was a great special issue. We had that proposal. I think Jacques Miller was the editor.
Jacques was the senior editor of Cognition, and then he got really into our face actually about the editorial process. And it was was one of the first times as a younger faculty member that I remember you and I had to bite back. Mm-hmm. And he was a very senior person. There were things where they were getting into our business, which was not appreciated actually.
The editorial, I mean, getting that proposal to put that special issue together was harder than actually writing the papers and getting it
Unbelievable.
effort. But the whole collection is fantastic. I agree.
Yeah, it's a real classic, and I think sort of missing these days, these kinds of collections. But so maybe that, I think that you guys have both brought up things that maybe can explore the origins of the model a little bit. So one thing that David said before was your work in vision, which I actually wasn't aware of. And we, maybe you could talk a little bit about that. And then right after that, maybe we can talk about with Greg, the idea of this issue of task, confounds, and this sort of literature that you guys are trying to sort out. So I don't know, maybe we can start with David and talk about vision.
Yeah, so there were two ideas for me that were in my head, and one was, so my sort of research assistant work had been on vision, visual neurophysiology, and I had helped with experiments on the Magno-Parvo system in vision and things like that. And I had taken a bunch of vision courses, and so that was one of the big flavors of the day when at that point in the early 1990s. And how do you develop the concurrent visual pathways? So that was obviously my own training. The other thing was in terms of that was sitting in the background, but in the foreground was my dissertation work, which was on this bilaterality issue. And one of my thesis committee was full of colorful characters. And one of them was actually David Kaplan. And David Kaplan thought I was absolutely full of it. And he wouldn't have a word of it. He was like Greg, only a little older.
One thing I want to say is that people think that the field is contentious now, but in my view, it seems like it's like a nothing compared to what you guys were experiencing in the mid 90s in the Boston.
There was mano a mano for sure. Yeah. Right. So David so that, he was very helpful, and he was sort of like as a member of my dissertation committee, very skeptical about this kind of claim that really the underlying processes, or the suite of computations that constitute the relevant processes that really are bilaterally mediated. But I was sort of, I was young and enthusiastic, and I thought that was basically on the right track, and I wasn't that willing to back down. So between that idea and then the idea, and I do remember that Greg at that point, when we started talking about this stuff, was obsessing about the Milner and Goodale relationship to action. So between the stuff on vision and the stuff on action, I think the ideas began to come together about what it means to have multiple pathways. But we didn't, it took us a while to get to the ideas. What are they actually for? What are they doing? And is it a hypothesis that makes sense? That's sort of more or less. Is that about right, Greg? Oh.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, it was. We started out with the bilateral claim, pretty simple, but the task we were looking at to make that argument was comprehension, essentially. And if you only look at comprehension, the data really clear. It's temporal lobe all the way. Not much frontal involvement at all in the data. And it wasn't until you look at patients who are trying to do syllable discrimination, for example, that you started seeing the involvement of motor speech areas or the inferior parietal lobe. So, and at the time, the claims about where speech perception were happening were all over the place. There were people claiming bilateral superior temporal. There were people claiming Broca's area. There were people claiming left inferior parietal area. There was no consensus whatsoever. And I think that the important insight that we had was things kind of broke down depending on the task. And then we started noticing some weird things. You get some of the work that Sheila had done and others in the 70s and 80s showing that you got double dissociations between the ability to comprehend words versus discriminate speech sounds, which didn't make any sense. That was a serious paradox. And then we started to notice that the areas that were implicated in performing these, what we called sublexical tasks or discrimination essentially, were the same ones that were being implicated in functional imaging studies of phonological working memory. So we started thinking about phonological working memory as what was being tapped into in terms of performing those tasks. And then the people who were working on the dorsal visual stream were talking about visual motor systems as being part of a visual motor working memory kind of system. So all those ideas kind of came together, and we said, well, language has got to work like vision in terms of needing sensory conceptual interface and sensory motor interface. and then the rest of the pieces kind of just fit together. So really all of these ideas were out there already. It was just a matter of sorting them and putting them together. That I think kind of, made a lot of sense to us anyway, not our reviewers, but us anyway.
Interesting.
There's a specific idea that if I just, one little nugget is that that fascinated me then, and it continues to fascinate me, and that actually still is investigated in the context of these experiments now, which is there was this work by, I think maybe originally by people like Mickey Goldberg and Richard Anderson and others on how you do, the notion of spatial gain fields in the inferior parietal cortex to coordinate visual input to reaching movements. And there was this whole literature on how you do coordinate transformations, right? So you're reaching for something, it starts in retinocentric coordinates, it has to go to, oculocentric and trunk-centric, and there's a whole literature on this interesting thing, and all that was in the parietal cortex too. And that was another one of those ideas from vision and visually guided action that turns out to be really useful in simply trying to, as background information, to think about the stuff in the speech case and the mapping to the articulatory or the motor system.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting. It seems like there's this sort of puzzle that was bothering both of you, different kinds of puzzles, and then really annoying you and then leading you to try to address it. And then that sort of seems to almost have spawned your entire careers from there in many ways. Is that fair to say? And maybe David, you could say that.
I think so. I mean, you look at some certain phenomena and then they just get under your skin, right? And then you just kind of keep plugging away. I mean, there was like the task stuff, for instance. I mean, Greg mentioned it. There were this series of papers by Sheila and Martha Burton. There was imaging studies where if they were, let's say, participants listened to words, had to make some, lexical decisions or something, you got really nice bilateral temporal lobe activation consistently. Then as soon as they did tasks that required, for instance, some kind of segmentation of syllables, other kind of meta-linguistic tasks, you started to see stronger lateralization, you started to see involvement of the inferior frontal gyrus and stuff like that. So these were sort of packages of data that were there and that were important in motivating, I think, the thinking behind this stuff. And yeah, you look at puzzles and you just kind of plug away at it a little bit. Yeah, that's right.
You think that's fair, Greg?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of a lot of what I ended up doing in the first part of the 2000s, it was following up on a prediction that we made. So, we posited the existence of a dorsal auditory motor stream for speech. We roughly localized it in that 2000 paper based on working memory research. So people like Ed Smith and John Janine said, we're doing work localizing the phonological loop, and that implicated frontal speech areas as well as the inferior parietal lobe as the phonological store. We took that to be the location of the coordinate transform, I think we called it, off of what Richard Anderson was doing in sensory motor work for speech. And so that predicted the existence of an auditory motor area for speech in the inferior parietal lobe. You'll see that in the 2000 paper. And then me and my students got on that with fMRI to see if we could identify it. And we used basically the paradigms that they were using in monkey work, where you listen to something or have some sensory input, you generate some motor output, and you look at what co-activates for the sensory and motor stuff. And we localized a circuit that included this area SPT that wasn't quite in the inferior parietal lobe, it was more in the posterior planum temporale region. So, and that is something that I worked on for close to a decade and still tinkering with it.
Mm-hmm. So maybe that's something you, Greg, could talk about, is like, what is your thinking about SPT now? Like maybe you mentioned it's this, the idea was based on these other fields, and the data that you had was the sensory transformation into motor space. What updates do you have for that now, or what do you think? Yeah,
well, the evidence for its existence have gotten pretty strong, and since we have it might as well go on record officially as to what SPT means. So we
you're on the record, man. This is about as
Greg. Yeah.
Brad Buxbaum was the grad student who did most of the actual work in identifying SPT, the functional imaging studies. And we were looking at individual subject data, and I remember leaning over Brad's shoulder, looking at the activation maps individually. And I was drawing in my little notebook all the different activation sites. And if any of you have looked at individual subject data, it's noisy, it's all over the place. So I was trying to make pictures to try to get a sense of where these things were. And this one spot kept showing up in the posterior part of the Sylvian fissure. And every time we look at a new subject, we'd say, is that the spot? Is the spot there? So we ended up calling it the spot. And then in our second paper, where we kind of followed up the first, replicated the result and then published, we wanted to name the area, and we couldn't name it the spot. So we came up with an acronym, SPT, which really means the spot, but we had reverse engineered a reasonable anatomical label, which is Sylvian parietal temporal. So that's the name of the spot. The evidence for the existence of something like a sensory motor interface is now really, really strong. So from stroke work to primary progressive aphasia, atrophy, a lot of it looking at repetition. It's really isolating this area, and we've been chipping away at it for a long time. So there's fundamentally something true about it, I believe. However, exactly what it's doing, I think, is kind of unclear. I don't think it's controlling the vocal tract in general. I think it has more to do with laryngeal control or some system that ultimately involves laryngeal control. And there's various reasons, I think, that probably aren't worth going into here, but I wrote a paper recently on that. What's the evidence for it being laryngeal control, which is actually quite interesting from an evolutionary standpoint too. But yeah, so I think it may have more to do with laryngeal control. And we're actively trying to identify the subtleties of this circuit, which I think is in that general vicinity. But it's like in the IPS, in monkey visual motor work, it's going to be more complicated. It's not like there's one blob that does visual motor transformation. You have different subsystems doing different things for different purposes.
So one question, so there are so many questions that it was just impossible to process. I did my best to reduce them down. But one question was interesting is there an SPT on the right hemisphere? And if so, what does it do? Is there, for instance, a conduction aphasia that's implicated in right SPT damage? This is I think Jonathan Fritz had asked this question.
Yeah, well, in our original studies, we sometimes see SPT activity on the right, and we plotted, the activation levels and the number of voxels, and there's an asymmetry. It's not like it's absent from the right, but it does seem to be pretty strongly left dominant. What is that area doing in the right hemisphere? I think it's still an open question. People have suggested prosody, but I'm not so sure that's the case. I think it's still an open question.
Fair enough. And I think maybe this is a good time to address maybe one of the most interesting questions, and then something that I'm curious to hear both of your thoughts on. But what do you think that what role the motor system in general plays in speech perception? And so I think maybe we should let's start with Greg, because I think his view may be closer to what you guys espoused in the models. And I'd like to hear what David has to say after that to follow up and discuss that. So Greg, what do you think?
Well, there's no doubt that there's really tight links between sensory and motor systems. That's been known for a long time. It's what direction does the information flow, and how is it functioning? That's the real question. We tried to measure the contribution of the motor system in speech perception in a comprehension task where we use articulatory suppression to interfere with motor involvement in perception. And we were able to get an effect in a pre-registered study, all behavioral, pretty decent psychophysics, I think. And we measured the effect. And the effect was the motor system can add about 1 dB of improvement. So that's it. It does something, but it doesn't do much. That amounts to about 5% in increase in performance, which is similar to the magnitude of the effects that you see in TMS and other sources. So,
right, and I think that's connected back to the original observations that you were making at the time developing the model, right? Is that if you looked at comprehension, patients with frontal damage did fine, but then if you looked at discrimination, then you got the deficits. If you did neuroimaging tasks that had confounds of like civil discrimination tasks, that kind of thing, then you got activation in frontal cortex, but maybe not so much if you did other tasks. So I think that's your sort of view is sort of consistent with that, right? It's sort of continuing in that line.
Yeah, all the work that we've done on this so far has been consistent with what David and I said in the 2000s, that it can potentially, contribute. I think we said that in one of our papers, maybe two, but that's not the dominant function. It's a production system that can be co-opted under some circumstances. And when you measure that effect, I think it's quite small and only under difficult listening conditions. So basically it's accounting for very little variance in the speech perception.
Right. And so, David, I think you've had a couple publications recently. I know one was with, I believe, Johanna Riemel. It was about the idea that the frontal cortex plays some kind of top-down modulatory role on perception. And the idea was sort of like there's these intrinsic oscillations, and that sometimes you have to reset them from internal top-down, mechanisms, and that the frontal cortex may play some role. Is that accurate? Is that your thinking?
Yeah, that's where one line of research is going. But let me for a second, since I have the floor.
You have the floor.
To the SPT sensory motor thing, because there's one thing I don't want to forget mentioning here, which is that in that area of research too, there's an anomaly that's bothersome, and whether or not there's a right SPT or not, I don't know. But there's there are data. A well-known paper of this is by Greg Kogan, a former student of mine, and Bijan Pesaran. Those are ECOG data showing a right dorsal stream doing all the things that you might expect. Now, Greg and I came out swinging that the dorsal stream structures and their function are strongly left lateralized. And annoyingly, it's annoying when one of one's own students thinks that's wrong. But
it's interesting because just to jump
really
into
interesting
that,
paper.
Edward Chong's data, right? The ECOG data he's been collecting on speech perception and the encoding of phonetic features on the superior temporal gyrus, right? He shows apparently very nearly identical effects in both hemispheres, right? In terms of
but then the ECOG data on the sensory motor transformation stuff, the Kogan et al. 2014 or whatever it is, something like that, a nice Nature paper, shows a completely bilateral organization, contrary to what Greg and I had claimed. And that's one of those anomalies in the data that we owe a story for, right? So is it the particular task? What's going on? I don't know what Greg's view on this one is, but this is one of those things that come out in the data that we don't have a good story for in, let's say, the canonical version of what we advocated. And so that's, so much for the sensory motor stuff in the right hemisphere. It's an unknown, what is it? An unknown unknown or a known unknown? Something we don't know in any case. But now with respect to the architecture of the back and forth of the motor system to the sensory system. So yeah, in recent work, so including a kind of perspective paper with Johanna Riemel and Luc Arnal and Ben Morillon, and then more recently in empirical experiments led by Florencia Asaneo. And there is some role for the motor cortex, and it seems to be pretty, and it seems to have something to do with the temporal structure of perceptual experience. It's restricted to certain ranges. And like Greg, I think the motor system's for motor stuff. And I absolutely think so it has some kind of modulatory function in the perceptual case. But of course, it does have a huge role in the learning case, right? So you want this kind of sensory motor connectivity to be working for the mapping from the motor output to the correct auditory target. So for that, it's necessary, if not sufficient, to have that kind of structure. And so for online processing, what that temporal parietal frontal link is about is a little unclear to me. But for the learning case, it's absolutely transparent. And so the question is it left over, actually? So is it a spandrel of language acquisition?
I guess that raises the question of how much learning is ongoing past, into old age, right? So, I mean, is it the case that this mechanism is constantly retuning the properties of the system dynamically? Is that an explanation for why, for instance, you would see activation in the frontal motor cortex in all sorts of these experiments all the time? It's just...
Well, there's tons of evidence that we use sensory motor circuits for updating speech, production. That's uncontroversial, all the perturbation experiments and so on. So, but I think it's important to be clear that the learning, I think what it's mostly doing in the learning is tuning up the speech production task. I mean, it's tuning up our ability to hit those targets for that purpose, not for perception. You can get people who never are able to talk and yet can perceive speech just fine. So, I mean, that was some of Dorothy Bishop's work in the 90s was really great, showing some of that. So, yeah, you need it to produce speech, but you don't need it to comprehend speech.
I guess I didn't have a question because I feel like this has been discussed too much, but the question of mirror neurons and any recent thoughts or updates you might have on that. We've heard a lot from Greg. I think there's a book that, you know, Greg wrote, The Myth of Mirror Neurons, which everyone here should buy if they haven't done that already, and read it. But maybe I'll just pose this to David. David, what do you make of mirror neurons? What is your line on them?
I think mirror neurons are the greatest thing since sliced bread. It's absolutely correct. Everything is right, and Greg is dead wrong on that. He dedicated years of careful reading and analysis and ends up being wrong. Mirror neurons are the answer to empathy, speech perception, autism, hair loss, aging. So, yeah, I mean, there are, as far as I can tell, I mean, if I come to mirror neurons through the lens of Greg, obviously, right, having listened to him and read his stuff. I mean, physiologically, there are such cells, right? There are like matching filters. There are cells. I don't think they're an overwhelming amount, but there are such cells in different. The extrapolation from that to a mirror neuron system that underpins understanding is, I think, highly optimistic, if not incoherent. I mean, it begs the question of what understanding is, what those things are even doing. So I think an interesting question would be, given that you have cells like that, what do they actually do? So suppose you stick your electrode in there and there's up to, let's say, 20 to 30% of cells that have that matching filter property. What are they for? What do they do? What could they possibly be the basis for? And I mean, and I have nothing against the kind of narrow interpretation, whether it's tuning of the input system or predictive coding of some form. I'm all good with that, but I need a much more restrictive hypothesis. So I'm with Greg on the myth of mirror neurons, that there's a bunch of cells that do something, but they certainly don't do what was claimed, which was, I think, an egregious overreach.
Well, that's I was hoping for more fireworks between you guys, and that was the thing I think that was going to be the most potentially contentious, and you've deprived me of that. So if you can think of anything, this is the time, right? If you can think of anything that you really think would be contentious and you have different perspectives on, I've got a question later that maybe we'll bring that up, but if there's anything now you guys can think of in terms of
right now, one thing that I absolutely disagree with Greg is his approach to, in every damn review paper that we write, manage to sneak in new data every single time. If you read those papers, in every one of the 3 papers, which I'm really attached to, and I think they've been great fun to work on and think about, Greg managed to sneak in original data that were not supposed to be in there. So good for you.
If you had some, you could put it in.
That's right.
So on that point, a question was submitted by, it looks like it was by David Poeppel. It was, when is Hickok and Poeppel 2020 coming out, or when's the next iteration of the series?
We started writing that a few years ago, a number of years ago, but it never got traction, I think. Yeah, it's probably about time.
It's time, and we're on it. We have some manuscript pages.
Mm-hmm. I guess you guys have really diverged in a certain sense, right? You guys both started off more in this, localization and hemodynamic imaging, and then David kind of went to the temporal domain, and Greg focused more on the spatial and aphasia domains. So maybe that's part of what.
I don't think we've diverged at all. We're just continuing to do the same thing that we've always done, which has been complementary from the beginning. So David has always been, he started out collecting data with MEG. My early work was aphasia, and so it was we're just different approaches. He's more interested in the dynamics. I'm more interested in the architecture, and I mean, the large scale architecture and the sensory motor stuff. So I we mostly don't pay attention to each other's work.
I mean, I think that's right. I mean, I think we're incidental travelers. Every few years we sort of throw our hat in the ring and come up with something, but I don't think yeah, I mean, I trust Greg to do his stuff right. I hope he trusts that at least I do part of mine right. And then we throw it in, we mix it up, and out comes hopefully at least a provocative hypothesis of some form.
Okay, well, maybe then we should dive into more questions about the model. So we had a few people asking about sign language. So the model's typically conveyed in terms of speech, but what changes or doesn't change with respect to sign language?
I mean, there are different circuits, I think. I mean, we did a little bit of work on this. And so you'd expect if you're doing auditory motor integration, you have to interface with the auditory system, at least at that level. If you're doing sign language, you're going to have to be connecting visual circuits with motor control, with somatosensory, which plays a role in both, but you'd expect more parietal involvement and so on with similar kinds of circuits. So I mean, it works the same. I don't think that there's a dramatically different computational or architectural plan for language of any type compared to even vision. I think my view is that you have these circuits that are doing similar kinds of things. You're taking sensory input, you're mapping it onto conceptual networks, and it's doing one kind of computation in general. And then you can have divergence within those systems to specialize in, going from speech to meaning or from visual objects to meaning, whatever. And then you're going from sensory representations to motor control at various levels, and you can get specialization in the subcircuits there. I think it makes a pretty decent, and I really do think of them as evolutionarily homologous, that these evolved from kind of ancestral circuits, and they've diverged to be specialized to whatever extent they need to be specialized to get the job done. But they look similar and they share properties because they are homologs in the evolutionary sense. So sign language would be kind of a cross homolog between visual motor control and language control. And its organization should presumably just fall out of what we know of the other circuits.
Well, David, I don't know if you ever done work on sign language, or do you have any comments on that? Because in the spectral domain, domain, things might be a little different than when thinking about from the spatial.
Right, but architecturally, I think it should be the same. So there's an interesting question in the thread here: how would area SPT change, for instance, in the case? And that's an interesting. So again, you have a mapping from some input system, which in this case is visual, right, to an output. So suppose you have to repeat a pseudo sign gesture. You still have the same problem. So this is a question from Jessica Michael. I think it's a good question. Is it going to be the identical anatomic location, or one that gets an adjacent one that has inputs from high level visual areas? That's a good question, and who knows, but it has to roughly do the same kind of computational task. That is to say, the visual input has to be analyzed and transformed into the effector space, right? So it's going from retinotopic to joint space coordinates. So it's probably right around there. Maybe it's a little bit more dorsal because it's closer to area 7A or parts of the IPL and less in the Sylvian area. But whatever it does, right, whatever its local circuitry does, should be pretty similar because you have the same requirements from the linguistic point of view. Right? So I don't think it should be different kind of, let's see so Karen says, what are the visual targets for production? Self-perceived signing?
I think you'd agree with this, Karen. I don't think that visual targets are the main thing that signers are going for. I think they're more somatosensory. Yep, okay, so got that one right.
So yeah, the question is what's phonology look like in the brain for sign language, right? If you think about the anatomical circuits, what are the areas that are relevant for processing sign language phonology? And then likewise for David, how do the temporal dynamics, play out? Let's say the hemispheric differences that some of your work suggested how does that play out in sign language? So maybe Greg.
You're saying phonology. One thing that we've been careful not to do is to is to say that this is phonology. I mean, we really don't know what level of linguistic representation or process we're tapping into. We can think, it's something to do with phonology. So, oftentimes we'll say phonological related or phonological like level, but we don't really know. So it's hard to answer that question specifically. But I mean, we have done experiments with the usual SPT localizer experiment is to have people listen to speech and then they silently say it to themselves. That's the motor part. And we look for co-activation during the listening and the silent reproduction. So we've done that with sign language and we get different patterns. So we see a more parietal shift. What looks like the signer's SPT is more dorsal in the parietal lobe, which makes sense because we already know we have visual motor areas in the intraparietal sulcus for reaching and grasping and other things. So it would make sense that you'd see that. We've also done experiments that suggest that there are, kind of ventral visual areas that show sustained activity during silent rehearsal of sign language. So there may be some kind of visual trace of what sign was, is being remembered, but I don't think that visual motor thing for everyday signing is the main sensory target. I think it's primarily somatosensory.
The issue is it still has to be a target that's not in the same coordinate space as the input, right?
Right.
Yeah. Therein lies the challenge for the system. I mean, you have to solve that particular problem.
Right, and that's not unique to language. It's
that's right.
In reaching, it's in eye movements, it's in everything. So yes.
So then, David, how does your hemispheric question of different temporal dynamics that characterize these systems for speech, how does that play out for sign language?
Very good question. I haven't the vaguest idea. I mean, I run into Karen Emery or Mairead McSweeney, and we talk about it for 15 minutes, and then we sort of capitulate, and we keep saying we should do a study. It's very unclear. I mean, it may be. So ironically, the temporal asymmetry idea is also 20 years old, or 19. And so I published that idea in 2001 for the first time, trying to spell it out more explicitly. And maybe that's sui generis to the auditory system. I really don't know. It would be surprising, actually. But I have no really good predictions what it would look like for the sign language case. I mean, I think it would be surprising if you have an operating system in the brain that gives you certain, it gives you what it gives. It's the biophysics of those circuits. If it were dramatically different, it's still, that's stuff that you have off the shelf. And how it would look for sign, I really don't know. And it would be good to have an answer from one of the experts on, what would be, for instance, different temporal hierarchies in a system like that. I just don't know. So it's a very interesting research question. And we even, a few years ago, Mairead McSweeney and I talked about really specific experiment, how to test that, but we never sadly got around to it yet.
Fair enough. There's been a couple questions. I think this is getting at Greg's sort of recent ideas of neurocomputational homologies, this idea that you can understand higher level aspects of language in terms of sensory motor dynamics, or in terms of what you guys are talking about, like, is the dual stream model in vision, is that inspiration for a dual stream language model, or is that actually a claim about evolutionary homology of computational systems? So maybe I'll start with Greg and come to David.
It started out as an inspiration, kinda, because I was, like David said, I was reading Milner and Goodale, and all those claims about visual system organization made a lot of sense. And we were seeing things that kind of related to that in language. So it was like an inspiration for thinking about how language works. But that's kind of been the approach that I've been using to look at how things work in other circuits. Like, what does it mean? What does a coordinate transform mean if we're trying to think about what SPT is doing? Well, it's hard to get purchase on that in humans. We don't have high resolution single unit data, but we can look at monkey work and make some inferences there. So we were able to think about that successfully, I think. And the more success I think we've had in using these inspirations, the more I feel like there's actually a claim there. And I actually do believe that we are dealing with real evolutionary homologies, that there's basic neurocomputational architectures that are laid out for sensory to concept understanding on one hand, and sensory motor integration on the other. And that there really was some kind of ancestral motor control circuit that, maybe through gene replication or something, you ended up with parallel circuits, that you could get some evolution of circuits that were specific to speech. So I really do think of them as homologous. And from there, once you get a basic vocal control, laryngeal control is thought to be an important early step in the evolution of language. Once you get control of the larynx and you get sensory motor circuits, maybe you can build related circuits for controlling the entire vocal tract to produce more complicated vocal gestures. And then maybe word level stuff can get worked in there, and syntax might have a similar architecture. You and I are working on that, William. And it seems to be working, which is surprising. So I really do think that that is a good way to think about how language evolved and how these circuits are organized.
Any thoughts, David?
Yeah, I also favor kind of evolutionary speculation, or computational speculation, in the sense that that kind of circuitry is likely has been around a long time, and it gets recycled, maybe in the sense of the way Stan DeHaan talks about recycling, right? So whatever these circuits are, looking back, we don't know. But they're somehow optimized to do certain kinds of things that are useful, right? So suppose it's multiplication. So suppose there's two structures, they happen to be connected. What they're really good at is multiplication. When insofar as that's actually, you can harness that, you can stick in terminal elements, A's and B's or X's and Y's, and output will be a product. And so if you have some local circuit, some canonical circuits that's evolutionarily made available, whatever ends up being the thing that you insert, the Lego block that becomes inserted there, gets treated that way. And that can be extremely useful for the visual case, for the vocal control case, and other cases. So if we think of, let's say, since we're kind of in dorsal stream territory, forgetting about claims about syntax for the moment, right? That's another whole line of argumentation, but just the sensory motor parts of dorsal stream things. There's presumably a huge amount of, let's say, computational recycling of what the circuits were made available to you through evolution. It would be weird otherwise. But they're probably conserved because they are useful and because they're flexible, because you can stick different things in at the terminal elements. And so it should be very similar across systems. I completely, so I see it very similar as Greg, with maybe slightly, variations of how we talk about it, but I think we are on the same page about how to think about it in a bigger picture.
I suspect it's deeper than the kind of neural retuning that visual word form area is assumed to take, happens in the visual word form area, because you can't train chimps to use language. So they've got pretty sophisticated visual motor circuits and so on. So
yeah, I mean, it's true that it's not, maybe the expression recycling is not good because Stan developed that specifically for the reading case, but it's sort of it's sort of multiplex use, right? It's not recycled, it's cycled, and it can be cycled in many ways given what is actually made available by the particular circuitry there.
Right. Yeah. So I think you need more than just you've got sensory motor circuits, and if you give the right input, you can map it onto the outputs, and then you've got language. It's not that simple. I know that's not what you're saying, but I think we have to think in terms of evolutionary circuits being tuned to some extent to be able to deal with the unique aspects of language. And I mean, one of the things that's attractive to me about this hypothesis, you have people coming from linguistics traditions who say, oh no, language is so special and unique. And then you have the trouble of figuring out how it could have evolved. Other people tend to find similarities between language and non-linguistic systems and say, look, it looks like this. Therefore, it's not unique, and everything that the linguists have been saying is BS. But if they're homologous, then you have a bit of both worlds. You have similarity to non-linguistic systems because they have common ancestors, and you have whatever uniqueness you need to deal with language because, you know, you're doing something a bit different. So I think it solves a lot of the problems that have split fields in the past. And that's one of the reasons why I'm kind of excited about it.
So I guess I have to ask this question because it's been on my mind a lot, is the Berwick and Chomsky thesis. They wrote this book, Why Only Us, right? And so what they propose is there's something that's human specific about language, which they attribute to merge, or this property of digital combinatorial infinity. And then they kind of say that there's this recycling process that you guys are kind of discussing, in the sense that you have pre-existing systems for what they call externalization, which we can think of as production and perception of language, which are then harnessed and retuned. Is that a reasonable view, or do you think there's something that's still missing from that kind of a perspective? Or maybe Greg can start there.
I don't know. I've been thinking about I mean, one of the reasons, and I don't follow Chomsky's work in as much detail as you do, William. So correct me when I get it wrong. But the move to merge is in part a move to make it possible with minimal, genetic change to get language. Right? You can't get the full-blown thing if it's all unique. So you have to make the unique part really small, so a single mutation can get you there, consistent with what Chomsky believes. If you think about that from other perspectives, so someone like Tecumseh Fitch argues that there's multiple components, and I find that much more attractive than everything, you just need this one little thing and everything else falls into place. I think there are multiple things that had to happen coming from different directions. Tecumseh talks about kind of combinatorial semantic, the evolution of more complex combinatorial processing at a very high level. One thought that I've had is that the kind of stuff that Chomsky's talking about in terms of basic abilities to put things together might be more related to that higher level kind of compositional semantic ability. But then you have to evolve all this other stuff. And that would kind of be consistent with, I know a view that you're sympathetic to, William, that this basic ability emerged to enable thinking more efficiently or deeper or whatever. And it wasn't language that it evolved for initially. So that would kind of fit with that view, I think, because it's a higher level combinatorial thing. And then you had vocal control evolving in its own right separately, and then somehow those things came together.
David, any thoughts on the Berwick and Chomsky thesis or the minimalist program in general?
Well, I mean, so the minimalist program is a super interesting intellectual exercise to try to streamline, a complicated suite of phenomena into simpler explanatory mechanisms, right? So now and I'm not a practitioner of the minimalist program, but I think I appreciate what the kind of the tools that gives you to try to explore phenomena in linguistics. With respect to the evolutionary thing, I feel neither here nor there. I'm not sympathetic to evolutionary speculations. I'm sympathetic to the position that the evidence is dead, and evolution is pretty complicated, and I have no idea what's going on. So if the basic property of language processing in the processing sense is what's called binary unordered set formation, that's remarkable. And if that appears, that is, there is a circuit that gets generated in some tissue that allows you to do binary unordered set formation, and it has interesting consequences, that's amazing. Right? So but it's a story like any other, but it's a very interesting one. And of course it needs a story. You need a story for what you call discrete infinity in language, right? It's very hard, otherwise it's kind of lame, you're dead in the water. My own current passion, or whatever you want to call it, is that the evolutionary story is not going to be one on that. So it's the really interesting thing is what it is that we have stored. Like, what are actually the terminal elements? What does it mean to have stored things that are like concepts which can be lexicalized, that you can then use? So the part of the concept that you can then insert into things like sticking stuff together. And it's the fact that you have a dictionary, something between whatever 10,000 and 200,000 things stored that have the format that they can be gotten to by the auditory system, they can be output to a motor system, they can be gotten to by vision, by touch, by text, and so on, and linked to concept. And that part, I think, is a little bit more mysterious to me. In fact, completely mysterious. I have the vaguest idea how to even begin to study that, because it's not just studying a list of words. It's an entire, sort of en bloc. What is it that our head has that other creatures don't have? It's not just that we can stick things together and put them in hierarchical structures and process them. It's that it has actually, as Greg raised, compositional semantics. I mean, you have to actually get the correct thing in, but then you have to interpret it. It's not just that you take a bunch of words out of a bag, stick them together, right? You have to get, they link to concepts. They have to stick together in a certain way. I mean, how much paper, how much space is there between the syntactic organization of the words and the semantic one where you then read out the meaning of the composition? I think these are ongoing research questions that are really difficult. But if I had to guess, I think that the question of what we know, what it means to have knowledge and store it and pull it out in real time is an even more difficult question than figuring out how to process things online with the elementary computations like what's called merge, but which is take two things, stick them together, and then give them a label. I mean, which is already pretty sophisticated.
I agree. I think maybe good to change gears a little bit, unless you guys want to have something else you want to say or add to this discussion. But there was one comment I got, which I found, I think, extremely interesting, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. I'm just going to read it verbatim. It says, I mistrust the majority of cognitive studies, especially from the time of the dual stream model papers, such as statistical issues or flawed interpretation of data. I tend to use this as an excuse to conveniently and lazily ignore old and thus definitely wrong literature, even more so conceptual frameworks that grew out of it, and pretend that literally everything is still up for my generation to be discovered. To what degree do you think this is a problem? How did you and how do you now deal with this problem? And what strategies would you recommend for the field as a whole to become less forgetful of what has already happened? So why don't we start with Greg on that?
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly, every generation is coming up against this, right? It's just the way science works, I think. When we were looking at the data in the late 90s, there was no consensus at all. Everyone knew the classical model was wrong in some respects, but there was nothing that replaced it. And like I said, you had different studies showing completely different lobes and different hemispheres for speech, for something as simple as speech perception. That should be the simplest thing to solve. And you might think, well, let me just start over. Let me just start doing some fMRI studies and then I can, answer the question. But the answer was in the literature. If you just go back and look at the literature, I mean, you can find patterns that hold across multiple studies, across multiple generations. You just have to work to look for them. So I think there's no reason. Well, first of all, I think it's absolutely correct to be deeply suspicious of any study. I'm deeply suspicious of my own studies. And you need to get it replicated and you need to look at other data sources. That's really the whole reason to do integrative research, is if you're getting the same answer when you look at stroke and when you look at functional MRI and when you look at ECOG, and it's all coming together, then you can be confident that there's something valuable there that you can take to the bank. Any single study or any single approach, I think is really risky to put any theoretical weight on that. So I would say that's exactly the right situation to be in. Distrust anything that is a one-off study. Don't believe the theories that are based on it. That's kind of what happened with mirror neurons, right? You had one kind of approach to neurophysiology in monkeys. They interpreted that and then ran with it without looking at lesion data or other sources, which constrains your interpretation. So
it's interesting because I think the questioner is sort of, you identified in both of your work in the 90s, you both had problems with the literature that existed. You said this interpretation is flawed, the statistics are bad, there's not enough power, they haven't done converging methods. And so then at that point, right, people agree, okay, there's problems. And then there's two paths you can go down, right? You can say, well, then I ignore it and I just redo everything from how I think it should go. Or you can just like bury your head into that literature and try to figure out, sort through all that mess and come up with a picture. Is that sort of, is that fair to schematize that?
A lot of the work at the time, like in the 90s, the only work that people were paying attention to were functional imaging. No, everyone just disregarded all the old lesion work and forgot about it. And so you had this functional imaging world with generating a lot of work. And now that we know, a lot of the pitfalls of what was going into these studies, it was a mess. David, one of David's, main contributions as a graduate student was to point out all the early studies on phonological processing identified different brain areas. So what do you do with that? Well, what you do with that is you go back and look at what Sheila and other people were doing in the 70s and 80s to see what constraints we can get from the lesion studies. And so that's what we did to put together the dual stream model. And if you look at every single one of those papers, we talk about evidence from functional imaging. We talk about evidence from lesion studies. We talk about any source of evidence that we can bring to bear. And it's only those that hold up across methods and across investigators and so on that you really should be confident using to build your models. Which is why things like the dual stream model are so vague in a lot of respects, because it's a framework. It's a really general way of thinking about things, but that's the best we could do in terms of what was consistent in the existing literature.
That's it, David.
Is this, I want to know if this is reviewer number 3 for me all the time. And could you please forward me this person's name and address so I can.
It's a single blind situation here.
Okay. No. I think, of course, skepticism is good. It's healthy. It's youthfully vigorous. And I think, and I think that actually Greg and I also have had that in the past and probably still do in, advanced middle age. Feel we should be skeptical towards everything. That being said, blowing off the past seems not super well motivated, because as Greg pointed out earlier, virtually all the answers that certainly we developed were in the literature. That is, I think I said this line in my lab the other day, but you will not be remembered for the size of your error bars, but for the quality of the ideas, right? So you can do much better experiments because your Bayes factor approach is so cool, and we have better designs, better higher spatial resolution, higher temporal resolution, but not the same conceptual resolution. You still have to have the ideas worked out, and many of these ideas are in the literature since the mid 1800s. And so my challenge would be to the challenger, it's totally fair to blow us off. Absolutely cool. Just say, yeah, these, in fact, we've gotten pretty hostile commentary over the years, Greg and I. But I would then challenge you to figure out which idea is it that you're actually going for. So if you're just going to do a bunch of experiments with, the better techniques, what is the source of the idea or the source of the model or the hypothesis that you're going to be testing? I think that's also a fair question. So you can, throw the baby out with the bathwater, but then you still owe a kind of superseding model that captures the same range of data in a more coherent way, say. So I'm totally sympathetic to the kind of the enthusiasm of just throwing out everything, but I've learned my lesson that by reading the stuff, there's look, spend 2 days reading stuff by Nicholas Tinbergen and Konrad Lorenz about ethology. That is time well spent, because those people actually, just through careful analysis and thinking about the problem, have come up with way more interesting ideas to think about behavior and cognition than we have. And so it's not a terrible idea to just kind of dig into that stuff and then do the better experiment. By all means, our experiments, of course, are primitive by today's standards.
So if I were a new PhD student, I would say you're both insane, because I have to get, I have to, first of all, finish my dissertation, then I have to find a job and get hired somehow. And that requires publishing a lot of stuff And you're asking me to go into the old shed and look through the old, things that have been discarded from years ago. You want me to spend 2 days reading, this literature? I don't have time to do that. I can't afford to do that. How would you respond to that student?
Go back home and continue reading. I just doubled your reading list by whining.
You're saying that there's no other way to do it. You're saying it's either you might as well quit. You're saying.
Well, inductive inference of that form just doesn't work famously. So I think that there's no substitute for. So look, one of the things that we certainly, that Greg and I have done over the years, both together and separately, is try to come up with an account that supersedes the kind of classical model of Broca, Wernicke, Lichtheim, and then the 20th century updates of that, right? But we did that, and I still think do it in deep respect for those older models that actually have serious explanatory value, certainly in the clinical context. So of course we write tons of papers saying, look, that's the old view. But I think you're not going to find bigger fans than Greg and me of, for instance, Wernicke, who is extremely careful, nuanced thinker about stuff without having access to 7T laminar level imaging, right? By just being extremely pedantic and thoughtful about the kind of conceptual nature of the problem. And so we have been, I think we're on record of saying, well, that turned out to be the wrong model. But it was extremely thoughtful and explanatory given what was known. Right, so this is sort of a next step, and of course this stuff is wrong too, but hopefully it's wrong in an interesting way, right? And so reading the stuff before, I think, is just, there's no substitute for it really, as far as I can tell, right? I don't know. Yeah, you got to read stuff.
And it was only wrong in detail. Fundamentally, it was correct. It was a dual stream model that preceded Unger, Leiter, and Mishkin, preceded all the other dual stream models that were developed over the decades. And there have been multiple dual stream models in frogs and different species. It's not a new thing at all.
Okay, well that I think is a good answer. And I agree that we have to read stuff. But do you think there's a problem with the field in the sense that we're being pushed to publish too many papers and not to read the papers? Maybe Greg can answer that.
Well, it certainly is hard. It's hard for me. I know I've talked to David about this before. It's really hard to keep up on the literature. I think it's just the price of doing science. If you could take a really small perspective and study one little thing, and the literature is readable in a few months maybe, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with a career like that. But if you want to see the big picture, do integrative work, you have to read a ton, and you have to somehow be able to balance those things. It's like everything, work-life balance. It's no different. You got to balance work and life. You have to be able to find a way to balance reading the literature as deeply as possible while getting papers out. And people do it. It's just part of being an academic these days, for better or worse.
I think it's just called the work balance. There's no work-life balance.
Yeah. We got rid of the life part. It's just balancing the different aspects of work.
This is a really serious and difficult issue in the sense that our generation, or the generation of our advisors and our generation, has done all of us a huge disservice by continuing on a system that's just not that helpful, right? So where we value certain things, perversely highly, although they're not that great, right? So the way we make hiring decisions, tenure decisions, promotion decisions are, necessarily, because the field is huge, based on some kind of weird quantitative criteria. Did you get your neuron paper or something like that? And that's on us, actually, right? So but it's a little unclear how to change an academic system in which we should say, look, William, you did a great job. You just spent a year reading and you came up with a really interesting summary of, early 19th century neurologists and their insights. We should value that too, right? You didn't get your Nature Neuroscience paper, but you made, and we don't have that system. And that's because we keep the same system going and going. And I don't know if it's a good system or a bad system, but I know it's a problematic system.
Mm-hmm.
And it does push us into a thing where there's expectations to have papers of a certain kind with a certain frequency, because those are the career filters. And that's obviously bad. I mean, that is on us. And I don't know, department by department, how to become better at valuing what really should be valued and intellectual inquiry.
Okay, well then, maybe on that point, David, I was going to switch gears a little bit and talk about your famous maps and mapping problem. And then, this is a question one person asked is, if you look at computer science, what people study is they study the software, and they don't really care too much about the hardware that could be implemented, because that's sort of orthogonal to the question. Mm-hmm. And so this reminds me of a great book review by Jerry Fodor. It's in the London Review of Books, where he talks about talking with cognitive neuroscientists and asking them what they do and why they do it. And he says something like, I'm interested in how the mind works, right? We know that the mind is somewhere north of the neck. Why does it matter how far? Is that a fair question? Is that a fair criticism?
Yes. Actually, that review starts with, I think the first line of that review is, why do people go on and on so about the brain?
Right. Why are we here talking about the architecture of these models and the temporal asymmetries between the hemispheres?
So look, I mean, so here's the kind of 5-cent tour of where I see this. So we're here in the business studying the relationship between brain and language, and you have to ask yourself what's in it for us, right? So there's, and I give this talk sometimes where I say, you must, if you're doing studies linking brain and language, you must assume that you're either going to learn something about language or you're going to learn something about the brain. If neither is true, then it's a case of what I call, interdisciplinary cross-sterilization. Right? So my assumption is you will learn something useful about how language works, tricky, or how the brain works. Now, how to study these things is, amazingly difficult. The way I've tried to cash it out in terms of this maps and mappings problem is, in work starting some years ago with Dave Embick from Penn, who's a linguist, a syntactician. We take the goal to be, so when we make maps, because making maps of the brain has turned out to be incredibly useful. Right, so the notion of retinotopic mapping or somatotopic mapping is just been, it's the very basis of our understanding of things, because we say, look, there's functional organization of the tissue. That's super useful and helpful. And we sort of inherited that because it's a successful model in the case of sensory motor systems. And so we've carried that forward to cognition in a way that's suspicious. Right? So we make functional imaging studies, and then we interpret, originally it was just blobs, right? So it was just like, this area is for that. And now it's, of course, we've just said networks, but that's just kicking the can down the road. It's not a better answer. But it's an important problem. It's like the homework problem. You need to know which part of the head to look in, and then but it's really just the basic first step. It's like your homework problem to then explore different hypotheses. So the maps problem is to use the best possible techniques and approaches and methods to really figure out, let's say, the functional architecture of the structure. The mapping problem is where the money is, and that's the hard one, right? So that's assuming that we take seriously the cognitive sciences, in this case, linguistics, and we likewise take seriously neuroscience. And so we have, the elementary constituents of both, or the primitives, as we sometimes call it, or the parts list, or the ontological structure. And then our job is to say, look, I think these 20 ideas from neuroscience are absolutely, defensible based on a shitload of evidence, as are these 20 ideas from linguistics. And our job is to figure out what a linking hypothesis might be. And it can't be, so the problem of mapping between these domains is not one of reduction. Right? So it will not turn out to be the case, as far as I can tell, that you just take, the notion of morpheme, and then it just maps onto 5 cells that are wired up a certain way. It may be true, but maybe not. But what really might be the case is that both, we need to figure out how to build bridging models or bridging hypotheses that take the primitives or the elements of linguistics seriously in a way that it can translate and likewise take the elements of neuroscience up a level to figure out where that connection might be. Unless you're a dualist, which is a fair thing to be, you can be a dualist as far as but if you're not, then we have to figure out some connection, right? We have to figure out how the stuff is implemented, and that's, you know, arbitrarily difficult. But that's the mapping problem, right? So to take seriously the conceptual commitments of psychology, cognitive science, linguistics, and to take seriously the commitments of biology and figure out what the form of linking hypotheses might be. And that's, you know, obviously a long-term research program.
Do you have an example? Do you have an example of, not necessarily from your own work, but something that you thought was a great example of pursuing that kind of integration?
Well, I mean, so I have an example. My standard example that I love, just because it's such an amazing piece of biology, is sound localization, right? So I've written about that a bunch. I wrote about it a bunch with, you know, with Bill Izzardi, with others, and so here's a case of it's sort of the Marr-inspired research program from soup to nuts in a successful way, right? So there's a particular computation that a organism has to do, whether it's an avian or a mammalian, right? So for instance, sound localization in the dark. There are different ways to do that. There's algorithm A, algorithm B, algorithm C to do that. Now, this was known, and this is, you know, those beautiful behavioral studies. Nobody figured out how, you know, what would you actually look for? So a bunch of models were advanced, famously one by someone named Jeffress, which is an algorithm how to solve this problem. So he advanced an algorithm that has something called delay lines in coincidence detector. So it's a particular wiring diagram that solves how you go from sound input to space. It's very simple, it's elegant, and it works, right? Now, what was really remarkable here is now you go from a pretty abstract computational behavioral problem, which can be characterized, you know, to arbitrary levels of precision, to an algorithm that can actually give you that. And the pièce de résistance, the really cool thing is that now a bunch of biologists, notably people like Konishi, Catherine Carr, and others, looked for a circuit that would give you that. And they found it, for instance, in the barn owl and other species. And here you go, and then you can go to an arbitrary level of precision in the biology, that is at the cellular level, at, you know, the local circuits and neurotransmitters, you name it, you know, the genetic expression of everything. So there, at least you have, from the implementation to the algorithm to the computation, a full linking. Now that still doesn't deal with the harder parts of a linking model, but it gives you a kind of an outline of what a research program could look like that's successful. That would be really difficult in the human case. But the fact that they worked it out is so amazing and cool that you can, that's soup to nuts, right? From, you know, from bits of a cell to really relatively complicated ethological behavior, the full thing, right? The whole, and that would be pretty cool. I mean, if we could do anything even remotely like that, it would be a next step towards a real linking hypothesis from the stuff of mind to the stuff of brain.
And this is espoused in a great paper that David just wrote. It was, I think, 2017 with Krakauer as the first author. Neuroscientists Need Behavior, I believe was the title.
Neuroscience Needs Behavior.
Yeah. Neuroscience Needs Behavior. I think that was an excellent review of this question of how do you really integrate these fields and actually solve some meaningful problems that you want to address. And I guess on that point, maybe I can ask this to Greg. If you're trying to integrate linguistics, is it fair to say that what David just described, that linguistics provides such a model, right? And then is it our jobs as neuroscientists of language to you know, take the detailed architectural linguistic models and figure out how that works in the brain? Is that fair, or is there something missing from that equation?
Well, it's fair. I mean, if if the goal is to understand the relation between, you know, language ability and the brain circuits that support it, then it may help to look at, you know, how language is organized according to what linguists are saying. That doesn't mean you have to believe everything they say. It might be organized slightly differently. So I think you have to look at the phenomenon that they've identified, pick up the big parts of what they're talking about, and see if you can find something in the brain that either relates to those parts or helps us think about it in different ways. And, you know, so I've never really understood. I mean, I understand people who are interested in the mind or language and not interested in the brain, to say, well, why does it matter where it is in the brain? It doesn't help me understand it. That's an empirical question. And I would admit we haven't, neuroscience hasn't really informed language science all that much. There are some examples. For example, in the 80s, the big question was the system interactive, kind of top down, or was it feed forward, modular? If we had known about or if we'd looked at the anatomy of massive feedback connections in brain circuits at every level, that would have changed the priors. And that's a piece of data that informs that debate, I think. So there are things that the brain can tell you in terms of the architecture. I think, if the scientific question is to understand the relation between brain and behavior, then obviously, like David was saying, you need brain and behavior. You just have to do the work to figure out what the relation is. I think it's worth saying something about architectures too. I mean, a lot of people have criticized functional MRI and lesion work as blobology, and it's not very helpful to make a box model. So David and I have made a lot of box models, and I've been criticized for doing that. But if you think about it, a lot of the work in, for example, artificial intelligence these days has been based on changes in architecture. You went from simple connectionist models where you had inputs, a hidden layer, and an output layer, and that was it. And they could do some things, but ultimately they failed. And then you had, the dark days of AI. And it wasn't until they changed the architecture that these systems became suddenly much more powerful. So you can think about box models as hypotheses about the neural architecture for a system. And if we could identify the architecture by doing fMRI and stroke work and other kinds of things, even if we don't know the dynamics, that can help us think about how the dynamics flow through that network. And since the architectures really determine how these things work to a large extent, that could be the key, rather than just looking at just the dynamics in general.
Okay, you guys have any more thoughts on that, David? Do you have anything
I'm a huge fan of. I mean, I'm a complete boxology nut. Are you kidding? I mean, I wouldn't know what to do with that. I mean, because what it does is it forces you to make some idea explicit, right? So of course you can make crappy boxes. If your boxes are really big, almost everything will fit in, right? But if you spell out, I mean, it is hypothesis formation or making explicit. And if we say, look, one of the things you have to do is you have to create a phonological, phonetic to phonological code of some form that has to be of a kind that it can map to stored things in the ventral stream, right? So you have some way of contacting stored information. I mean, that's a hypothesis about a little bit about where and certainly what has to happen. And then we can begin to go into it, right? So we can figure out what is, what has to be the mapping from an acoustic type of representation in the auditory cortex to something a little bit more phonetic or phonological codey to then a pointer to a stored representation. I mean, these are, without boxology, I mean, you can pretend you're not doing it, but I think in the privacy of your own head, you sort of do boxology anyway. It's just kind of pre-theoretical thinking about stuff. I love our boxes. I think Greg and I have some of the greatest boxes, tremendous boxes.
On the point of your wonderful boxes, what is some piece of data that would disprove some central tenets of the dual stream model? Like if someone were to do a neuroimaging experiment or some mapping study, what would be a piece of data that would really torpedo the dual stream model? I don't know if maybe you haven't spent as much time thinking about that, but Greg, go ahead.
Left frontal lesions causing major comprehension problems.
Any thoughts, David, as to?
Yeah, that's certainly the top one, right? And if you, I mean, that would in one fell swoop basically call it into question.
Mm-hmm. And then you also have this idea of the left laterality of the dorsal stream, right? So I guess if you showed right frontal lesions strongly impairing production, then that would be another piece of evidence, right?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. I mean, there's lots of ways to falsify this model.
Mm-hmm. And then of course you have like you said, you have the boxes, right? And you draw anatomical labels, right? So showing that some process is not in the box. Would that be another way of doing that?
But I think the anatomical commitments aren't that. I mean, I think they're reasonably but they're reasonable. I don't think we don't have to get overly exercised if a box shifts by a centimeter. But of course, we know more about neuroscience now, and we have stronger commitments to where to look for certain things, and we've done more work over the last decades, right? So I would not be totally moved if someone says, well, it's really more this part of the angular gyres that you have to pay attention to. Like, yeah, whatever.
Every paper we move a box a little bit.
So
every paper we move a box a little bit.
We moved boxes, yeah.
People haven't noticed the subtle Easter egg changes in the model over the years, you guys did. Okay, then how about this? If you could think of each other's careers, okay, maybe we start with David. What would be your biggest critique of Greg's work over his whole career? What would be the thing that really bothered you, and then maybe you just kind of tamped down and didn't really drive home too much, or maybe you have, but we don't know about it?
I think every word he says is true. Now, I don't know if I have a big critique. My gut feeling is that Greg spent, to his credit or to the field's credit, an enormous amount of time studying and debunking the mirror neuron stuff, when I think his one paper, 9 Problems of Neurons, would have actually sufficed to undermine the entire enterprise. I think he went to way extra lengths to do something where he had an amazingly clever paper that undermined the whole field, and I wouldn't have had to read those other 250 pages. So
okay, that seems like a compliment there. Okay, Greg, what do you think? What is about David's work would you critique that you would?
I don't have any real critiques. Like I said, I don't pay attention to it that closely. But
is that the critique?
no, it's interesting. I mean, it's interesting work. I'm like David, I think, suspicious about the role of neural oscillations and how causal they are, as opposed to epiphenomenal. I think that I'm not yet fully convinced, but doing the work that he's doing, there's nothing. It's fantastic work, and it's worth pursuing. And I think there's my hunch is that there's something there, but I'm not convinced yet. But yeah.
Well, that's fair. And
it is, in fact, I agree, a very tough area, and it's a contentious area in physiology itself. But sort of incrementally, step by step, it's building up to, I think, something where you have to pay attention to it. It's worth paying attention to. But yeah, it's an area full of debate and controversy whether it's a real thing. But I feel like there's a there, so I'm not going to throw that one out.
Fair enough. Okay, maybe back to Greg. So what about your work? Like if you look back on the model or your work, what would have surprised you? Like if you go back to yourself 20 years ago, and then you look at what happened since, what would have surprised your 20 years younger self?
I'm pretty surprised, honestly, how most of the predictions and hypotheses have been borne out.
You guys have all these the biggest problem is that we were so right that we don't have anything to do now. It's like
no, there's a reason why I think that a lot of the data that has come out since is basically consistent with what we claimed. The model wasn't based on a single study, or it was based on all the literature preceding what we said that we could get a hold of. And so we looked at multiple sources and only put bets down on those components that were well supported by a vast amount of diverse literature. And so, I think that's how you pull big principles out of the muck in a sense. But what you trade off is computational specificity and explicitness. So, there's a dorsal stream and a ventral stream. That's pretty weak as a claim. It's not surprising that it turned out to be roughly correct. The SPT work, I think, has been supported with the neuropsychology pretty well, but there have been surprises there. Like, there's things that we missed, early signals that the way we were thinking about it in terms of vocal tract control generally was probably incorrect, that we bowled past and have now had to circle back and think about again. But the big principles have held up because I think we're only emphasizing big principles that were well supported.
David, anything that would have surprised yourself 20 years ago about what's happened since?
I mean, I'm endlessly surprised all the time, and less so about I'm super happily surprised that people still read art papers and cite them. Thank you so much. Cite early, cite often. That's a very happy surprise. Actually, one thing we haven't said is that, I mean, for historical reasons, so when Greg and I first sent these papers out, certainly the first one, you would not believe the amount of grief we got. I mean, this was not a fun, I mean, this was brutal. And so one of the things that I guess is surprising, just as a kind of, brief reminiscence, is that, when we started out, we got a lot of bad press. People saying that we were kind of crazy lunatics, or like that person was asking earlier, like youthful, throwing everything out. And then some years later, we've become the target of everyone. So now it's like, well, the old, classical, stupid dual stream model. And so the question is, when were our good years, right? So the first years we were considered insane, and now we're considered old guard. And so I'd like to have a year in the middle where it was just like easy going, just kind of cruising along. But I'm happy. So just for historical accuracy, it's not like it's been all so straightforward. I'm a little surprised. So I guess I would have been surprised that a lot of the lessons from cognitive science were not really learned. So one of the things that Greg and I think pointed out, and I think we're right about that still, is that we're just not careful when we do experiments about the tasks and what it means to use tasks and what the consequences is of those tasks. Mm-hmm. And I thought we were pretty muscular on that and clear. And it does surprise me that even after that, and after some years of kind of harping on that fact, there's just an enormous amount, like an orgy of studies that are really not careful about using or interpreting, having a theory of the task, that is interpreting the task very carefully and narrowly with respect to what can be interpreted from that task. So that is a little bit of a bummer, in the sense that I thought we were, for the cognitive neuroscience of language, very clear about it, and repeatedly in paper, and our own papers and our joint papers, and that somehow didn't take, right? There's still just a ton of papers where you're like, what? That's a perfectly nice study, and all you're going to learn is about that particular idiosyncratic task. It has like no bearings on anything else, and so that's a little bit surprising and disappointing, I think.
Yeah, that's
interesting. Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to reinforce that. It is terribly surprising, and I was just looking over our papers again today, and it seems like the beginning of each paper we emphasize the task matters, the task matters. And I think in part when we wrote the next iteration, it was to reinforce that people haven't gotten the task message again, and tried to get stronger and stronger. And it's, we first pointed that out in 2000, and we've been working on it in various experiments, trying to shore this up. And finally, after 20 years, we've been able to publish a stroke study showing large scale, showing very clear dissociations in behavior and anatomy of the two tasks that we were talking about in 2000, the single word comprehension and syllable discrimination. Same patients, different neuroanatomy, non-correlated essentially in behavior. So, but 5 years from now, people will still be using different tasks and not paying attention to what they're doing. I'd bet on that.
So this is, I think, a really interesting point. So, like, going back to your early work, right? It was sort of critique of very artificial tasks, which did not tap into ecologically valid mechanisms. So, right, the classic case, syllable discrimination. You think you're getting at phoneme perception, but really you're getting at something else, and you're not really tapping into whatever's relevant to comprehending a word. And then you guys were like, okay, well, let's understand the task in detail. And then, I mean, I think you're both also good examples of people that have used a lot of very effective artificial tasks in the lab. And now the zeitgeist is such that people are very much interested in naturalistic paradigms, right? So again, there's sort of like a reaction to maybe the usage of artificial tasks that may mislead you. What do you think about that trend to sort of using naturalistic materials and methods? Maybe David could start.
So look, I mean, certainly in the work in my lab is very much kind of a constant negotiation between particular tasks that are very narrowly construed to deal with something versus naturalistic, let's say, listening to stories, which we've been doing lots of. And one of and what would be nice is a sort of intermediate thing. I've just been working with a bunch of people in the lab on building a large corpus of spoken stories, but they're so carefully constructed that all the materials are actually controlled. So it's like having a real psycholinguistic experiment that we actually had someone write stories around it. So it's a real narrative. It was a bit of a pain, but it's kind of cool. So there is always this trade-off. One of the things, so somebody in the thread here was asking about the role of AI. And so I don't know about AI, but it's just the new methods, whether they AI or machine learning methods more broadly, allow us to begin to probe data in a new way that we hadn't been able to do before, but in a way that's actually sort of hypothesis driven, right? So we can, so I've, one of the NYU students, Laura Williams, is defending next week, has done really nice experimental work on having people listen to stories, but then address based on naturalistic data, imaging data, and ask, and in fact answer questions about things like invariance of phoneme representation across positions, or can you decode things regardless of where they are, or at a particular point in time, can you decode multiple phonemes? That kind of sort of classical questions of spoken language comprehension or speech perception. And so the new techniques are allowing us to do that with naturalistic materials, but it's entirely question dependent. We're never going to get away from having to do extremely targeted things if we have a well worked out model, right? I mean, it seems, but I think you have to go back and forth between these things for sure.
Greg, any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, someone else threw out computational modeling. We're dealing with difficult problems, and there's no way we're going to be able to solve it by studying one method or one approach. So we have to throw everything we have at these problems and see what comes out. So computational modeling, use AI if that's productive. Try things, they might not work, they might work. If they work, great, but don't hold back. Throw everything we have at these problems and see what sticks. There's no other way to do it in my mind.
I do like the focus that you've always had in the sense of understanding the task. It's not purely a decision of what stimulus to use, but understanding the latent processes that are elicited and used in a certain temporal dynamic during that task. Is that a fair thing? That's the goal, right? Is to understand what the stimulus is telling you about behavior or cognition.
Well, you have to have a theory of the task, right? So, I mean, you have to, obviously the materials are critical, but also what's happening, as you present the materials, what kind of, what's the decision about a material? In the end, presumably, if we're interested in aspects of language, of comprehension, production, or whichever aspect of language we're interested in, you have to pick this, you have to be a radical decompositionalist or whatever, right? So you have to pick the thing into little pieces and really figure out what's going on. And then there's going to be some latent subroutine that says, that's the one I'm really interested in, because that's what I think is going on when you do, whatever, morphology in Arabic, or, as I'm going through spoken language. You have to analyze the details carefully. And especially for those things, obviously linguists can be super useful, right? So linguists that are excited about that can tell you, look, you have to pay attention to this and that, the other thing. That's where you really capitalize on each other's expertise, I think.
Well, I think it's just an interesting point that, you can criticize the task that someone is using, but you can't solve it by just changing the task, right? You have to solve it by understanding what the task is telling you, and then you can use a different task if you want. That's just interesting.
I think it would help if people just change the way they think about tasks in general and think about it in terms of generalizability. So the reason why we focused in our very first work together on comprehension, because that's what we were interested in understanding. So we were looking at comprehension tasks. If you're studying syllable discrimination, if you're interested in that task and you want to map the neurobiology of that task, then that's the task for you. Then you can work out the neurobiology in much detail. But if you're actually interested in comprehension, you have to ask the next question. Does your syllable discrimination task generalize to comprehension? And that's an empirical question. I mean, we think about generalization in terms of population statistics, and we have statistical tests to say, well, is this going to reliably generalize to the population, or is this population sample specific, think about the task that way. Are you just studying that task, or is it going to generalize? There's no statistical test for that. So we have to use task decomposition. We have to think hard about what we're doing, or just brute force it empirically, measure it. Compare the performance on a task you're trying to study, like comprehension, with a task you think might be useful because you get better control, like syllable discrimination. And if they perfectly predict each other, you're golden. If they don't, well, you have to think about that.
So, okay, I guess we're getting close to the end here. And the last question I had that I think we should try to address is just any advice that you have for students that are now starting, facing some of the challenges that I mentioned, like this pressure to publish a Paris, which the flames have only gotten higher and hotter, I think, as time has gone on. So any advice for students to pursue a meaningful and successful career? Maybe David, you could start.
Pursue a successful, meaningful career.
Yeah.
Like
You're gonna have both, right?
Run. Well, I am. So my standard package is, first of all, work hard and be nice to people. That's a picture that my family gave to me, for an artist, which is actually hanging in my office. A good reminder when I walk into my office, and a good reminder for people when they have an appointment with me in my office. Just work hard and be nice to people. That's actually gets, it's pretty good. And also, by the way, be especially nice and appreciative of the people who make it possible for you to actually be a scientist and to do research, like, your parents, your partner, your kids, and your friends, because we're in very privileged positions, actually, right? We get to do the stuff we think is really cool. And there's a whole infrastructure of people around us that lets us do that. And that's already quite remarkable. So be nice to them. Well, so my advice, I guess, on the intellectual things is don't be afraid of anything. Don't be afraid to ask questions. Don't be afraid to get in trouble. Free yourself from the praise of others. Right? Just, because why the hell not? Read old stuff. I think that's maybe what read old stuff. It's just better written, by the way, too. Older papers tend to be written much more elegantly. And
like older papers, like a series of papers by Hickok and Poeppel.
Those are too young. I mean, read like stuff from the 50s backwards. But the well, actually, hold that thought. Read Rules and Representations by Chomsky. You should read that. That should be part of your, So, if I could start over, I wish we're good at things like, probability theory and Python, P and P. It would be really useful to have those kind of skills. Keep your sense of humor. There's a lot of things there. I think there's more things about life that I care about than about specific job advice. Like, it's supposed to be fun. I mean, the reason we do this is because it's exciting to sit around and, Greg and I get to draw boxes with something and say, what if it's this? And that's kind of, that's joyful, and it's a huge privilege. And the fact that we are allowed to do it should be kind of embraced. But in addition to probability, and if you need specific things, probability, Python, and read old stuff.
Okay, Greg, advice?
I think probably the main thing, I see a lot of students getting really discouraged these days, like, something's not working, or you're discouraged about this or that, or you get rejected or whatever. Try not to get discouraged, because oftentimes what happens is the papers that get rejected or the ideas that get dismissed out of hand are the really interesting ones. The paper that David and I first wrote did not appear in the original journal we submitted it to in 2000. It was rejected at Neuron. And then we had to grovel with an editor of TICS at a conference to consider it. And then the recommendation was reject. And the editor, TICS was relatively new. The editor was like, well, we like controversial things, so sure, we'll publish it. And so don't get discouraged. And you'll constantly get knocked down at conferences. Your grants will get rejected, and your papers will get rejected, and people will tell you you're an idiot. in one way or another. But just be persistent and don't let it get to you. Treat it like your game. It's a game. You're just playing a game, and you got to make the next move and just keep moving on. And as long as you're having fun, it's a fun way to make a living.
Is there anything else you guys wanted to add, or I think this is probably a good place to stop, if otherwise. So what I'm going to do here, there's still about 100 people here. I'm going to try unmuting everyone simultaneously, and then if you could please applaud, and then we'll see what happens when this occurs. Okay, so I'm going to do a countdown: 3, 2, 1. I'll applaud. That worked out well. So anyways, thank you guys both so much for doing this. And I know this was unexpected, and it was probably more than, kind of bit off more than I think I could chew here with this whole event, but thank everyone else for coming and paying attention and submitting your questions. And this will hopefully be posted soon. You just have to process the video and then maybe edit the transcript or something like that to post it with that, and should be available soon. But thank you again, Greg and David, for doing this. And we look forward to whenever that paper is, whenever it's going to come out, we look forward to hearing it, seeing it presented. So thank you so much.
Thank you, William, for doing it. It was very great fun.
Yeah, no worries. Okay. See you guys later.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Or, okay, all the time.